The house stood as an old sentinel, perched on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. Its dark silhouette loomed against a bruised sky, with winds howling like the voices of forgotten souls. The air carried the salty tang of the ocean, but beneath it, there was something else, an oppressive, unnatural stillness. The warning signs of the coming storm had been clear for days, but they had ignored them. Why spoil a perfectly good Halloween with unnecessary fear? Paul, the de facto leader of the group, was the one who had suggested the house. "It's got history," he'd said, flashing that confident grin that always managed to convince the others. The place had belonged to his great-uncle, a sea captain rumored to have lost his mind before his mysterious death. Paul brushed off the old family tales as nothing more than the fabrications of a superstitious age. The group had gathered, 6 friends in total, ready to face the night in their costumes, laughing and drinking despite the looming threat of the hurricane. The radio crackled with the repeated warnings, urging the coastal residents to evacuate, but the group was far too caught up in the excitement of the night. The storm, they thought, was just another dramatic touch to their Halloween. Sarah, Paul's girlfriend, shivered as she stood near the large bay windows, staring out at the ocean. The waves churned violently, thrashing against the rocks below, yet the horizon held an eerie, unwavering calm. "Maybe we should leave," she murmured, but her voice was lost beneath the raucous laughter of the others. "Relax, babe," Paul said, wrapping his arm around her shoulder. "It's just wind and rain. Besides, what's the point of a Halloween party if we don't add a little danger?" The house groaned under the pressure of the rising wind, and for a moment, the lights flickered. Jake, the joker of the group, raised his glass. "To the storm. May it blow our hangovers away by morning." His toast was met with cheers and the clink of glasses. But there was something more in the air now, a thickness, a weight that seemed to press down on them. The wind outside had shifted, now shrieking like a thing alive. The first flashes of lightning illuminated the darkened sea, revealing jagged rocks beneath the foaming waves. Paul, still grinning, gestured toward an old chest in the corner of the room. It was one of the few relics left from his great-uncle's time. "Anyone want to see what old Captain Ridley left behind?" The chest creaked as Paul lifted the lid. Inside were damp, brittle papers, charts of the sea, and a bundle of old clothes that seemed untouched by time. At the bottom, a single leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Paul flipped through it casually. "Just a bunch of ramblings," he said, but his eyes caught on a page marked with heavy black ink. "The storm, they come with the storm, the ones we couldn't save," Paul read aloud, but his voice faltered as a sudden gust of wind slammed against the house, rattling the windows. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. Jake laughed. "It's just the wind, Sar." But another gust hit, harder this time, and with it came a strange noise, a low, mournful wail that rose from the sea and seemed to seep into the very bones of the house. The laughter died in their throats. For a moment, they all stood silent, listening. The wail grew louder, echoing through the halls like the cries of the lost. Paul closed the journal and set it aside. "Okay, maybe that's enough spooky stories for one night," he said, trying to sound lighthearted, but the unease had settled deep in their chests. Sarah moved closer to the window again, peering out into the darkness. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw a figure standing on the rocks below, staring up at the house. A man, or what looked like a man, drenched and bedraggled, his face pale and hollow. "Paul," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's someone out there." The others rushed to the window, their eyes straining against the storm. The figure stood motionless, just beyond the reach of the waves, his gaze locked on the house. Another flash of lightning revealed his tattered clothes, those of an old sailor. "He looks dead," whispered Emily, one of the quieter friends, as her voice trembled. Before anyone could speak, the figure vanished, swallowed by the darkness as the wind howled louder, shaking the very foundation of the house. But the wail was no longer coming from outside. It was inside. It was in the walls. The house groaned again, but this time it wasn't the wind. The oppressive atmosphere within the house thickened as the wail reverberated through the walls. The sound was not merely auditory but visceral, seeping into their very beings, like a sickening weight on their chests. Paul, once the confident leader, now stood motionless, the journal still clutched in his hands. The others exchanged uneasy glances, as if each was waiting for someone to break the silence. It's just the wind," Jake muttered, though his bravado faltered. The jovial light in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a nervous twitch. But deep down, they all felt it. Something was wrong. The wind, the storm, the figure on the rocks. It was as if the natural world itself had turned against them. The house groaned again, louder this time, as though responding to some unseen force that pressed against it from all sides. "Maybe we should leave," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing roar of the storm outside. Emily, pale and trembling, took a step back from the window, her wide eyes staring at something unseen beyond the glass. "We can't leave. It's too late." Paul frowned. "What do you mean, too late?" "We just—" But before he could finish, another flash of lightning illuminated the sea, and there, in the frothing waves, more figures appeared, pale, gaunt, their eyes hollow like the man they'd seen earlier. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. Silent, wraith-like forms emerging from the black depths, their faces frozen in expressions of despair and fury. "God, are those people?" Sarah's voice cracked as she pressed herself against Paul. Paul stood frozen, unable to look away from the spectral army gathering at the water's edge. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as a cold, unnatural fear gripped him. These were no ordinary phantoms. There was something ancient, something deeply wrong about them. The sea had given them up, but for what purpose? As if answering his unspoken question, the journal slipped from his fingers, its pages fluttering open as it hit the floor. The inked words, once illegible in their disarray, now seemed to burn into his mind. He knelt, his fingers tracing over the last entry. "The storm brings them back. They hunger for life, for warmth, to escape the ocean's grasp. I hear them at night, scraping at the walls, seeking their release, seeking new bodies." Paul's heart raced as he flipped through the journal, skimming entry after entry. The writing grew more frantic, the ink smeared as though written by a trembling hand. The sea holds the damned, the lost souls of those claimed by the waves. They linger in the deep, waiting for the storm that will set them free. The room grew colder, the temperature plummeting as though the very air had been drained of warmth. The others gathered around Paul, their faces pale as the words took hold of them, each of them feeling the weight of the truth that had been buried for so long. "We need to leave now," Paul said, his voice shaking, but firm. But as they turned toward the door, the house itself seemed to rebel. The front door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, and the windows rattled as though being battered from all sides. The wail, no longer faint, now rose into a crescendo, like the cries of the drowned echoing from the very depths of the ocean. "They won't let us leave," Emily whispered, her eyes wide and glassy. She stood rigid, staring at the walls. "They're already here." The others turned slowly to face her, but she was no longer looking at them. Her gaze was fixed on the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed unnaturally thick, as though something was stirring within them. At first, it appeared as just another trick of the light, the flickering of the candles casting erratic shapes on the walls. But as their eyes adjusted, they saw it, movement. Something was crawling out of the darkness. It was slow at first, an almost imperceptible shift in the shadows. But then, with a sickening clarity, they saw them, wet, decomposed hands, stretching from the corners of the room, their fingers grasping at the air as though trying to pull themselves out of some unseen abyss. Faces followed, waterlogged and twisted, their hollow eyes fixed on the group. The air grew colder still, freezing to the point where their breath misted before them, and the wailing grew deafening. The spirits of the dead had crossed the threshold. Paul grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the door. "We have to find another way out." But as they turned, they were met by the figure from the shore, the same man, or what had once been a man. His clothes hung in tatters, dripping with seawater, his face pale as the moon. His eyes were black, endless pits, voids that seemed to pull them in. "You shouldn't have stayed," he rasped, his voice a hollow whisper that carried the weight of centuries. Jake, who had stood frozen in terror, finally snapped. He lunged at the figure, his fists raised in desperate defiance. "Get out of here!" But as his hand met the figure's chest, it passed through as though the man was made of mist. Jake stumbled, eyes wide in disbelief, before the phantom gripped him with cold, bony hands. In an instant, Jake's scream was cut short, and the color drained from his face. His body crumpled to the floor, lifeless, leaving the others staring in mute horror. Paul staggered back, dragging Sarah with him. "We have to get upstairs." "Now," he shouted, his voice cracking. They fled toward the staircase, the sound of their footsteps drowned by the rising wails of the dead. The spirits were closing in, their spectral forms seeping from the very walls, as if the house itself was bleeding the souls of the lost. And from outside, the storm raged on, as if nature had joined forces with the damned. The house groaned under the weight of the storm's fury as Paul and the others scrambled up the narrow staircase, their hearts pounding in their chests like the relentless beat of drums. The wailing, which now felt as though it came from within the walls themselves, grew louder, a chorus of the damned rising in a cacophony of despair. Each step they took reverberated through the old, wooden frame of the house, as though the very structure resented their presence. They reached the upper hallway, a narrow corridor lined with doors leading to rooms long abandoned. The air up here was different, colder, heavier, as though the sea itself had invaded the space, bringing with it the scent of salt and rot. The flickering light from their phones did little to pierce the thick gloom, casting only fleeting, jagged shadows along the walls. Paul glanced back, making sure the others were following. Sarah, pale and trembling, clung to his arm. Emily and Mark were behind her, their faces twisted with the same mixture of dread and disbelief. Only Jake was missing, his lifeless body somewhere below, now a victim of the storm and the horrors it had unleashed. "We should hide," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. "Maybe they'll leave us alone." Paul shook his head, his mind racing. Hide? From what? These were not intruders they could escape from. These were spirits, bound by something far older than this house, something connected to the sea and the dead who had long been lost to it. He forced the words out, his voice shaky but determined. "We need to find the source of this, whatever it is. We can't just wait for them to come for us." Mark stepped forward, his usual bravado stripped away, replaced with a haunted, almost childlike fear. "But what is it? Why is this happening?" Paul had no answers. The journal's warnings were vague, fragmented pieces of a puzzle that he couldn't yet fully grasp. The sea, the storm, the drowned souls, somehow they had all been drawn here. Or perhaps it was the house itself that had called them, beckoning them toward this moment. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the hallway, like the splintering of wood under immense pressure. The walls around them seemed to pulse, as though something beneath the surface was struggling to break free. Paul felt it, a strange, oppressive energy in the air, pressing against his skin, filling his lungs with a suffocating weight. And then, as if summoned by the very mention of their torment, the first door at the end of the hallway slowly creaked open. The sound sent a shiver down Paul's spine. It wasn't the wind, it couldn't be. The door had moved with a deliberate, almost menacing slowness, as though something on the other side had been waiting, listening for their presence. They stood frozen, staring at the dark gap beyond the door. The light from Paul's phone flickered and dimmed as if the very shadows were sapping its strength. "Should we?" Mark began, but his voice faltered, trailing off into silence. Paul stepped forward, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to flee. But he couldn't. Not now. They had no escape. The storm outside raged like an angry god, and inside, the house felt more like a prison with each passing second. He had to know what they were dealing with. With trembling hands, he reached out and pushed the door open wider. The room beyond was small, barren except for an old, rusted bed frame and a cracked window overlooking the storm-lashed sea. The air inside was thick with the stench of damp and decay, as though the sea itself had taken residence within these walls. But it wasn't the room that made Paul stop. It was the figure standing in front of the window, looking out into the night. It was a man, or what had once been a man, tall, gaunt, his clothes hanging in tatters, soaked through with seawater. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his hair hung in wet, stringy clumps over his face. But it was the eyes that made Paul's blood run cold. Black, empty voids. They reflected no light, no life. Just an endless abyss of darkness. The figure slowly turned, its head moving with a sickening, unnatural jerk. Its mouth opened, but no words came, only a sound, a deep, guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. Sarah let out a strangled cry and stepped back, pulling at Paul's arm. "We need to get out of here." But before he could respond, the figure took a step forward. Then another. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Water dripped from its body, pooling on the floor at its feet, as though the sea was following it, clinging to it like a shroud. Paul backed away, his mind racing. This was no ordinary apparition. This was something older, something that had crossed over from a place beyond the living. "The journal," Emily whispered suddenly, her voice trembling. "It said they needed bodies. They want to escape the sea." Paul's heart pounded in his chest as the full realization hit him. The storm hadn't just brought the dead to the surface. It had brought them here, to this house, because they needed something. They needed them. Another figure appeared in the hallway, its twisted, waterlogged body dragging itself from the shadows. And then another. The drum were coming, their eyes hollow, their mouths agape in silent screams. "They're going to take us," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with terror. Paul turned, his mind frantic for an escape. But the house had become a labyrinth of shadows, and the dead were closing in. Outside, the storm raged on, a relentless fury that mirrored the violence of the sea. And within the house, the tide of the damned was rising. The howling wind battered the house with relentless fury, each gust reverberating through the ancient wooden bones of the structure like the groans of a dying beast. The windows rattled as though they too were possessed by the same malevolent force that stirred the ocean, threatening to shatter under the pressure. Inside, Paul and his companions stood frozen in terror, their minds struggling to comprehend the horrors unfolding around them. The air had become thick, almost tangible, as if the very atmosphere were a manifestation of the sea's wrath. Cold, briny moisture clung to their skin, and with each breath they took, the taste of salt and decay filled their mouths, mingling with the rising bile of fear. The figures, the drowned sailors, were no longer just apparitions. Their presence felt physical now, their waterlogged forms dripping with the stench of the abyss from which they had come. Paul felt a deep sense of dread wash over him as he turned to face the looming figures. Their faces, gaunt and pallid, bore the unmistakable marks of death. Flesh, bloated from the long embrace of the ocean, hung from their skeletal frames in ragged strips. Their eyes, hollow, black pits, gazed at the group with an unsettling hunger, devoid of any trace of humanity. "They're coming for us," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Her words were a reflection of the one thought racing through each of their minds. There was no escape. The storm, the house, the ocean, it had all conspired to trap them here, in this moment, with these revenants of the deep. As Paul's mind raced, a thought clawed its way to the surface. The journal. In the chaos of the unfolding nightmare, he had nearly forgotten the cryptic warnings it held. There had been something about the sea, about the souls lost to it, and a way to keep them at bay. His heart pounded as he struggled to remember, to pull the fragmented words together in his mind. "The sea does not forget, it does not forgive," he muttered under his breath, recalling the ominous lines that had once seemed like the ramblings of a madman. "What?" Sarah asked, her voice taut with panic as she clutched Paul's arm. "The journal," Paul said, his voice louder now, more insistent. "It talked about the sea, about how the souls lost to it, they're bound to it. They can't leave unless they take the living with them." Mark's face turned ashen as realization dawned on him. "They're here for us, to drag us back to the ocean." Emily gasped, backing away from the advancing figures. "We need to get out of this house." But there was nowhere to go. The storm raged outside, a furious wall of water and wind that would tear them apart the moment they stepped out. And inside, the dead were closing in. As the first of the sailors stepped fully into the room, Paul felt an overwhelming sense of ancient, incomprehensible malevolence radiating from them. This wasn't merely the vengeance of restless spirits. It was something far older, an elemental force that transcended life and death, born of the sea itself. The ocean, that eternal, abyssal entity, had claimed them long ago, and now, in its insatiable hunger, it had sent them forth to claim more. The sailor's arm reached out, fingers twisted into claws, grasping at the air as though already seizing their souls. Sarah screamed, pulling away, but the waterlogged figure moved faster than its decayed appearance suggested, lurching toward her with a predatory swiftness. Paul acted on instinct, grabbing an old iron candlestick from a nearby table and swinging it with all his might. The metal connected with the figure's chest, and for a brief moment, it staggered backward, a hollow, guttural moan escaping from its gaping mouth. But the blow did not stop it. The sailor regained its balance and continued forward, its eyes fixed on Sarah with a relentless, otherworldly hunger. "We have to find another way," Paul shouted, looking around the room for any means of defense. But there was nothing, no weapons, no exit that could lead them away from the horrors that closed in around them. Emily pointed to the window, her eyes wide with desperation. "The attic. There has to be an attic." Paul followed her gaze, and there it was, above them, a small wooden hatch in the ceiling, barely visible in the dim light. "It's our only chance," he said, his voice grim. "We have to get up there." The group scrambled, searching for anything that could help them reach the attic door. Mark pulled a chair from the corner, tipping it over in his haste. As the dead sailors drew closer, the sounds of water dripping from their bodies grew louder, like the rhythmic pounding of waves on a distant shore. Every step they took brought the scent of rot and salt closer, a harbinger of their inevitable doom. Paul climbed onto the chair and pushed at the attic hatch. It was stiff, warped from years of neglect, but after a moment of desperate force, it creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark space above. He pulled himself up, his heart pounding, then reached down to help the others. Sarah was next, then Emily. As Mark began to climb, a cold, wet hand clamped down on his ankle. Mark screamed, kicking wildly, but the sailor's grip was unyielding. "Help me," he cried, panic surging through his voice. Paul grabbed Mark's arms, pulling with all his strength as the sailor below yanked him down with impossible force. Emily and Sarah joined in, their combined effort just barely enough to break the sailor's hold. Mark tumbled into the attic, gasping for breath, his face pale and streaked with tears. The attic was dark, musty, filled with the scent of old wood and dust. But it was safe for now. Below, the dead sailors continued to gather, their hollow eyes staring upward, watching, waiting for the moment to strike again. As the storm outside reached its peak, Paul knew that they were not merely trapped by the elements, but by something far worse, an ancient, vengeful force that had claimed countless souls before them. And now, it demanded theirs. The attic was a sanctuary of silence, save for the howling storm outside and the distant, rhythmic thudding of waves crashing against the shore. The four survivors huddled together, trembling, their bodies pressed against the cold, splintered beams of the old house. Below them, the drowned sailors continued to stir, pacing the floors of the house like caged beasts. But something was different now, something far worse. Paul's thoughts churned in a suffocating dark. It wasn't merely fear that gripped him now, but something deeper, an ancient and pervasive dread that clawed at the edges of his sanity. His mind felt as though it were being tugged by unseen currents, slowly unraveling under the weight of knowledge not meant for the human mind. The air was thick with a suffocating presence, something more primal than the spirits below, something far older than the sea itself. "I can still hear them," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "But it's not just them anymore, it's something else." Paul looked at her, his heart sinking. He knew what she meant. There was a new sound now, a low, pulsing rhythm beneath the roar of the wind. It was like the heartbeat of the ocean itself, deep, ancient, and insistent. And within it, Paul felt something calling, beckoning from the depths. It wasn't the sailors. It was something far worse. "We're not safe here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "They'll find a way in. They're waiting." "No," Paul murmured, shaking his head. "It's not them. It's something else, something below the waves." He struggled to put the feeling into words, but how could he? How could he explain the weight of the terror that was slowly crushing him, a terror that transcended the physical? The drowned sailors were mere servants, pawns to a force far greater, a force that had slept beneath the ocean for eons, waiting for the storm to awaken it. The journal's words came back to him in fragmented pieces. The sea does not forget. The sea is a gateway, a prison for those that anger it. But there are things beneath it, things that never die, things that hunger. His blood ran cold. He had thought the journal's writer was mad, but now he understood. This was no mere haunting. The sailors had been cursed, yes, but the storm was something more. It had come to release them, to reclaim what the ocean had long held prisoner. And it would not stop until it had consumed them all. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed from below, shaking the entire house. The wood groaned under the strain as if the very foundations were being torn apart. Paul and the others scrambled to their feet, their eyes wide with terror. "They're coming!" Mark shouted, his voice breaking as he stared down through the gaps in the floorboards. But Paul knew that wasn't what had made the sound. The sailors were no longer the worst of their concerns. "It's not them," Paul yelled, his voice raw with desperation. "It's something else, something older." A low, guttural rumble rose from beneath the house, as though the ocean itself was growling in fury. The air became unbearably thick, each breath a struggle against the unseen pressure that seemed to be building around them. And then, in the distance, from the direction of the sea, came a sound that froze Paul's blood, a deep, haunting call, like the bellow of some immense creature stirring in the abyss. Emily clasped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. "What is that?" she whimpered, her voice breaking with fear. Paul didn't answer, because deep down, he knew. The sailors were the messengers, but the true horror was the storm itself, the harbinger of something ancient and insatiable, something that had slumbered beneath the waves for untold millennia, waiting for the right moment to rise. Another crash echoed through the house, this time accompanied by the sound of splintering wood. The walls began to tremble, and Paul could hear the sailors below, their voices now mingled with something far darker. They weren't just speaking, they were chanting. "Thyanar. Ithgulithin." The words were alien, twisting in the air like a foul miasma, but Paul understood them instinctively, as though the meaning had been etched into his mind by some ancient force. "They're calling it," he whispered, horror creeping into his voice. "They're calling it from the depths." The storm outside intensified, the winds howling like a chorus of damned souls. The house groaned, its very structure beginning to give way under the assault of the supernatural forces converging upon it. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, as though the very walls were echoing with the voices of the dead. Suddenly, the attic door burst open, torn from its hinges by an unseen force. A wave of icy, briny air flooded the room, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of the sea, salt, decay, and something far worse. And then they saw it. Through the open hatch, they glimpsed the ocean, or what should have been the ocean. But now, the water churned with unnatural fury, rising in great, frothing waves that crashed against the shore. And from beneath its surface, something enormous stirred, something too vast to be seen in its entirety, but whose presence was undeniable. A great, writhing shadow moved beneath the waves, its form hinting at tentacles, scales, and eyes, so many eyes, staring up at them from the abyss. Paul's mind teetered on the edge of madness as he gazed upon the impossible form. This was no mere spirit, no wandering soul, it was a god, an ancient entity from the farthest reaches of reality, drawn forth by the storm and the sailors' cursed chant. The house trembled violently as the thing beneath the waves began to rise. The ocean itself seemed to obey its will, the waters lifting, towering above the shoreline as though reaching for the heavens. And with it came the undeniable truth, there would be no escape. Not from the sailors, not from the storm, and certainly not from the thing that lay beneath the sea, waiting to reclaim the souls it had once lost. The house, now a fragile shell battered by the unrelenting storm, groaned in protest as the waters surged higher. The monstrous shadow beneath the waves writhed with grotesque purpose, its form barely discernible in the chaos. The chanting of the sailors echoed louder, more fervent, as if they, too, were caught in the pull of something far beyond their understanding. Paul's knees buckled as he stared into the abyss, his sanity unraveling in the face of the colossal horror rising from the sea. He could feel it now, an ancient consciousness pressing against the very fabric of his mind, filling him with thoughts that were not his own. There were no words for it, only impressions, endless depths, cold darkness, and an insatiable hunger that reached out from the eons. Emily clung to him, her sobs lost in the roar of the storm. "We have to get out," she screamed, though her voice trembled with the futility of the plea. "There's nowhere to go," Paul whispered, his voice hollow, devoid of hope. "It's already here." The floorboards beneath their feet trembled, and with a sharp, violent crack, the walls of the attic began to split. Through the widening gaps, the ocean surged into the house, bringing with it the stench of salt and decay, as if the very sea itself had come alive with the malevolence of the entity below. Mark let out a strangled cry as the water reached his feet, the icy cold biting into his skin. "It's coming for us. It's dragging us down." Paul's mind spun. The sailors, their souls were bound to this thing, this unfathomable force, but it wasn't enough. The entity wanted more. The storm was merely a gateway, a door that had been forced open by the cursed chance, allowing the sea to reclaim those who had defied it. And now it sought new victims, bodies to possess, minds to break, souls to consume. The realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about the sailors. It was about the sea itself, a living, breathing entity of chaos and hunger that had been awakened from its slumber. The storm, the sailors, the ancient chants, they were all part of some grand, incomprehensible design. And they were caught in its grip. With a deafening crash, the walls of the house gave way, and the sea poured in, sweeping over them in a torrent of freezing, black water. Paul struggled to keep his head above the waves, but the force was too strong. The others screamed as they were pulled under, their cries swallowed by the roaring water. For a brief moment, Paul's vision blurred, and he was submerged in darkness. The cold was unbearable, a crushing weight that seemed to press against his lungs, suffocating him. But within that blackness, he felt something stir, something vast and alien, its presence wrapping around him like a suffocating embrace. It was then that he saw it. Through the murky depths, a shape emerged, impossibly large, writhing with countless tentacles that stretched across the expanse of the abyss. Eyes, too many to count, glimmered in the deep, reflecting a malevolent intelligence far beyond human comprehension. It was ancient, older than time, and it was awake. Paul's mind shattered at the sight, his thoughts dissolving into madness. There was no escape, no salvation. The thing beneath the sea, the thing they had disturbed, had claimed them. And it would continue to claim others, again and again, until its hunger was sated. With a final surge of power, the storm and the sea became one, and Paul felt himself pulled downward into the infinite depths where light and hope could not reach. He could hear the sailors' voices still, chanting in that cursed, guttural language, their souls forever bound to the entity that had devoured them. And as the last breath left his lungs, Paul understood the terrible truth. The storm would rage on, the sea would always hunger, and the abyss would never release what it had taken. For the sea, in its endless depths, held dominion over all that dared to cross it. It was eternal, and so too was the doom that awaited those who trespassed upon its ancient, forgotten shores. The world above would never know the truth of what had happened that night. But beneath the surface, in the cold, dark waters of the abyss, Paul's soul joined the countless others who had been consumed by the storm of the condemned. And there, in the infinite blackness, the call of the abyss echoed on, forever. The end.